Good evening. Donald Trump's in town and the government's in turmoil over Brexit. Plenty to talk about on the Late Debate tonight, where we start with Brexit, with possibly the unlikeliest of rebels to challenge Prime Minister Theresa May. 21 years ago, Dominic Grieve was parachuted into the safe seat of Beaconsfield after the sudden resignation of the sitting MP caught up in a cash for questions scandal. The Tory Association chair described their new candidate as a dark horse who came up on the outside.
When Dominic spoke, he just took the hall by storm, really.
By 2010, he had a seat at David Cameron's cabinet table, where he was appointed Attorney General in the coalition government. He took up the case of the Hillsborough victims, overturning the original inquest verdicts of accidental death.
I've decided to take an exceptional step and announce that on the basis of what I've already seen, I am persuaded that an application to the court for fresh inquests must be made.
When television presenter Stuart Hall was jailed for sex offences, the Attorney General went to the Court of Appeal to successfully challenge Hall's sentence on the grounds it was too lenient.
The law has worked properly.
But in 2014, Grieve was sacked in David Cameron's reshuffle.
Well, I don't know why I've been shuffled in one sense. Nobody's given me a particular reason for it, apart from the fact the Prime Minister wants to refresh the Cabinet, which is what Prime Ministers will nearly always say is their intention.
Cameron's decision to call a referendum on EU membership saw Grieve firmly supporting Remain and taking issue with some of the claims made by his Eurosceptic Conservative colleagues.
We're voting to be a hostage, locked in the boot of a car, driven by others to a place and at a pace that we have no control over.
This is all nonsense.
Grieve also chairs the Intelligence and Security Committee. After the referendum, he emerged as one of the leading Tory rebels opposed to Brexit, with this characterisation of the result.
Last summer, we carried out, perhaps without realising it, what was, for better or worse, a revolutionary act.
In the parliamentary battles that followed, Dominic Grieve invoked the words of Winston Churchill.
As Churchill said, he's a good party man. He puts the party before himself and the country before his party, and that's what I intend to do.
Joining me now is Dominic Grieve on what has been yet another momentous and chaotic day as Parliament and the government attempt to deal with the fallout from the European referendum. Dominic, we heard you there talk about the referendum result as a revolutionary act. What did you mean?
It was revolutionary in that the people who voted for it almost certainly voted, for the most part, in the name of what they saw as tradition. Traditional values, getting back to putting the country in a place where they thought it ought to be and it had lost its way. But it's revolutionary because it completely upsets the existing legal order and the existing relationships that we have. And revolutions are very dangerous things, and when you start on them, you usually lose control of them, and you very often find that they don't end up where you expect them to go.
Are you suggesting voters probably didn't realise they were voting for revolution?
I didn't get that impression on the doorstep. No, they were voting because they were angry with a whole range of issues, some of which they attributed to the EU, some of which they probably attributed to the political class generally, and to a sense of being let down. But I'm not sure that they had anticipated or expected the sorts of problems that we've now had developing over the last 2 years, and which, in my view, were pretty predictable at the time we carried out the vote.
Do revolutions end happily?
Very rarely, and that's the problem that we have. You can see what's happened with this revolution. It immediately got rid of the existing Prime Minister. We put a new Prime Minister in place. She tried to get a fresh mandate to carry out the changes that were going to be needed with a substantial parliamentary support. She wasn't able to get that because people weren't prepared to focus on the really key issues which might have led to her getting that mandate. We are now in a position where the government has great difficulty operating at all, and there's no alternative. The opposition is as divided on this issue as indeed the government backbenchers are.
Extraordinary day in the Commons today. The sitting had to be suspended because MPs hadn't seen the white paper that the new Brexit Secretary was introducing in the chamber. You have seen it now. What do you make of it? Does it go far enough?
It broadly reflects what was said at the end of the Chequers summit. And to that extent, it certainly forms a coherent basis to start a negotiation with our EU partners. And it's a miracle in the circumstances that we've succeeded in getting a cabinet to agree on such a document. Of course, it doesn't address all the issues. I continue to worry about our service industries, which aren't just about the City of London. They will be excluded from this, and there may be some advantages for some service industries, but for others, it may be very damaging.
Legal services, financial services are incredibly important to the City of London. Without any reference to that in the White Paper, what's going to happen?
I worry about that because they're a very important part of our GDP. You know, that's where most of 80% of our wealth comes from, the generating of services. And do bear in mind, it's not just the City of London. It's also engineering, it's transport, it's the services which are provided by a company like Rolls-Royce to follow up the sale of their engines. So, in fact, this is a very, very complicated sector, which on the face of it is excluded from this at the moment, and we think we're going to go it alone and that we may be able to manage. I would like to explore in much greater detail that issue, which I actually think Parliament hasn't focused on enough. But that having been said, I do understand the government's difficulties, and I do also recognise that this is a reasonable starting place for the negotiations. But we're going to have to face up to the fact during the negotiations that if we're going to achieve a deal, there'll almost certainly have to be some compromises on both sides.
And where do you think we'll end up?
I don't know. I can see that the EU, I'm sure the EU wants to give us a deal. It's not in the EU's interest that we should end up with a no-deal crisis, which would be a pretty catastrophic one for many parties. And I don't think they want that. But I do think that there is a risk as this negotiation unfolds that there will be levels of dissatisfaction with it because it will highlight some of the obvious tensions and inconsistencies that were bound to follow from Brexit and the decision that was made 2 years ago itself.
You were one of the leading rebels, as we said. What was it like? How toxic was it for you?
I think the toxicity can be exaggerated. The media build it up into a great crisis, but on the whole...
No, I've heard you in the Commons, in the Chamber, talking about it.
Well,
talking about death threats.
The death threats, which are the result of the way the media deal with this directly, because the media set the mood music, which is then followed by social media, and you then get the hysteria and the anger and the overreaction. Amongst one's colleagues at Westminster, things are in fact much more reasonable. And of course we have disagreements, and this has been a real tension and problem. But I think people may misunderstand that there is a high level of mutual respect at Westminster, and I think this is an issue where people have just got to accept that there are disagreements which simply can't be brushed under the carpet.
What did you think of Theresa May's Chequers statement? Did you welcome any of it?
Yes, I do welcome parts of it. I mean, I welcome the obvious fact that she wishes to have a free access into the European markets for goods, absolutely vital to our future, and frictionless trade. And that she's also, because she's a unionist to her fingertips, understands the massive risk to the Union of the United Kingdom if a hard border were to develop between Northern Ireland and the Republic. But you've then got to follow through the logic of that, which is if there is not to be a hard border, we are going to, as she has now indicated, have to stay in a frictionless trading relationship with a high level of regulatory alignment. What does that mean? It means that we have to have a common rule book. And what happens when you have a common rule book? You've got to have a tribunal for interpreting those rules and arbitrating on them.
And that currently is the European Court of Justice.
Yes, it is, and I'm afraid it's going to continue to be the ECJ. Some of my colleagues just don't seem to understand how international treaties work. They treat the EU as if it was some sort of imperial entity. We are seceding, leaving it, and we will have an eyeball-to-eyeball negotiation, and they will give us what we want. It's not like that at all. This is an international treaty organisation underpinned by a rule book and with a court or arbitral tribunal to resolve disputes.
Now, how do you square that circle with those colleagues of yours who don't see it that way?
Well, I'm not sure that you do square the circle. Unless they come to an understanding of the realities of international engagement, we are never going to reach a solution that they're going to be prepared to accept, because the only solution...
They're not all lawyers. They don't all understand it quite the way you do. Do you think Brexit is unstoppable? Have you lost that argument completely?
I have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, my view has always been that we have to respect the decision of the electorate in the referendum unless or until it becomes clear that the electorate ought to be consulted about something different.
That's only if there's no deal.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's no deal, or Parliament can't reach agreement, or indeed it becomes clear that the sort of deal on offer is at such variance with what people expected on either side that it would be proper to go back and say to people, is this what you really want?
So a second referendum?
Well, I think that might be necessary, but please don't misunderstand me. I'm very conscious of the fact that if we can come to some package which commands a broad level of acceptance, then a second referendum, or the people's vote, or however you want to call it, might not be required. But I do think that you shouldn't exclude possibilities. And what has always worried me about this debate is that some of my colleagues are so determined to leave, whatever the consequences, that they have been going around trying to make it impossible to do anything about consulting people again before we go. And that's something I will resist, because I think that logically we have to be prepared to listen to what people are saying to us.
Dominic Grieve, thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, American President Donald Trump should be settling down for the night about now in the American ambassador's house in Regent's Park. Or maybe he's even watching a bit of late-night television. Watch your Twitter feed to find out. However, I think it's safe to say that not everyone in London is happy that he's here. It wasn't the state visit promised by the Prime Minister in Washington, but a short working trip which will see President Trump spend just 2 nights in London. Air Force One dropped him off at Stansted after a brief flight from Brussels, where he was asked about the protests awaiting him.
I think it's fine. I mean, I think they like me a lot in the UK. I think they agree with me on immigration.
President Trump is unlikely to see the inflatable caricature demonstrators plan to fly over Parliament Square. But not everyone finds the baby blimp amusing. Damien Smith runs a pub in Hammersmith. His wife is a New Yorker. He's so incensed at the protests, he's renamed his pub to show his support for the president. The Jameson is now the Trump Arms.
When I see all the negative publicity about, President Trump's visit to London, it's just, I was horrified to think that it had gone so far, and they were so small-minded with this balloon and all the rest, and it's just, it's not nice. It's disgusting, really.
Amy, Julia and Amelia work in Mayfair. They're friends and Americans who've moved to London. They welcome the protests against their president.
I feel, as an American, really supported by people marching down the streets, balloons being flown in the air.
The fact that he's pushing our allies away, that he's calling into question NATO, and at the same time praising Putin, praising Kim Jong-un, this is disastrous policy.
I think that state visits have lost some of their power by his going to places like North Korea and meeting with Putin. And so if you want to present yourself as a world leader, but you meet with those kind of people, you shouldn't come and meet with Western leaders and act like it's the same thing.
The authorities are taking no chances. For this visit, the president has swapped his armoured limo for his helicopter. His trips to and from the ambassador's residence in Regent's Park will be along corridors of sterile airspace. Even if protesters are visible, they're unlikely to be heard over the clatter of rotor blades. To discuss what the American president's visit means for London, I'm joined by the Ealing Central and Acton Labour MP Rupert Huck, for the Conservatives by Croydon South MP Chris Philp, and for the Liberal Democrats by the Carshalton and Wallington MP Tom Brake. Welcome all of you. Chris, why should we be rolling out the red carpet for him? He's just started a trade war against Europe and he seems friendlier with the Russians.
Well, there's no red carpet that I've seen. This is a working visit, not a state visit. And, if the leader of the world's most powerful country wants to come and discuss issues that are important to the United Kingdom, we should have a discussion. And where we disagree on things, and we do disagree on some things, we should say that firmly and respectfully and hopefully get some change as a result. You never get anywhere by shutting down dialogue. So I think it's right we're having a working visit. And like I say, I haven't seen any red carpet being rolled out so far.
Rupert, will you be protesting?
I've got lots of constituency engagements that were organised before I knew about this.
Constituency engagements too, but I'll be protesting in spirit,
if
not in body.
Do you think he should not be here?
I mean, I think actually that it's been done with indecent haste. The way that Theresa May went running to him, the first leader to have met him, and she's been with him for 2 days at a NATO summit. I mean, she could have raised things there. But it just shows how desperate that we've become for trade deals, that she's willing to hold hands.
They are kind of important if we're coming out of the EU, aren't they?
I mean, look, she's holding hands with someone that she should be holding to account, and she's actually criticised his policy of... I mean, there's such a long list of things you could name. Climate change denial, putting kids in cages and using them as a prop by claiming it's the Democrats' fault. There's just so many
Tom,
things.
Tom, he's notoriously thin-skinned. Shouldn't we be flattering him, sucking up to him even?
Well, I think, unfortunately, even that won't do the job because I think he's so unpredictable. I mean, whilst I'm not happy that he is here, I think it's inevitable. He is the head of state of the US, and therefore we do need to receive him, but I think in a low-key way. I just regret the fact that there isn't perhaps going to be an opportunity for him to hear from perhaps members of Parliament, for instance, about our views, as Rupa was saying, on things like climate change, where he is playing a wholly destructive role, and on issues to do with, for instance, international organisations. I'm really worried that he is going out of his way not only to destroy NATO potentially, but even the WTO. So we might have the irony of the UK government calling on perhaps getting no deal in relation to Brexit and then trying to fall back on WTO rules that President Trump has just destroyed.
What do you all think of the balloon, Chris?
Well, I think it's a bit of a silly gimmick. It's a pretty immature stunt, but I also believe in free speech and I think the right to free and peaceful protest. So if somebody wants to put the balloon up, they've obviously got the right to do that. Free speech is at the very heart of our liberty. Of course, it's in the American Constitution as well. Personally, I think it's immature, but I defend people's freedom to be immature if they want.
He's such an attention seeker that he's probably enjoying it, to be honest.
What about you, Tom? You like it?
Well, I don't have any problem. Freedom of speech allows people to do things like that. I think the real test is whether President Trump can respond to it humorously or whether instead he seeks to identify someone that he wants to turn into a victim.
Chris, do you think Sadiq Khan, in sanctioning the balloon, has done his reputation any damage?
Well, I mean, it's a bit of a gimmick, isn't it, by Sadiq Khan? I wish he'd spend more time focusing on cutting crime, which is his job, and less time pontificating, which is what he seems to do. But like I say, I do believe in free speech, and I think it would be wrong of a UK politician, the Mayor of London or anybody else, to try and deny people's right to protest.
Chris talks about cutting crime. We're 20,000 police officers down, and the police bill for this visit is huge. There's sort of all leave has been cancelled from all over the country. Forces from everywhere are descending on defending this little orange man with small hands.
Come on, he's the president of the US.
But
I've got to talk to him.
That
was a cheap shot, Rupa, really.
No, seriously, the police bill, and there was a question on this in the House this morning, and the way that these police have been treated, they've been put on camp beds.
Yes, we've heard that police have been sleeping in gymnasiums with not many toilets per police officer.
4 toilets for 100 police. It's not like this was unforeseen. We've known about this for ages.
But a huge police bill's inevitable, isn't it? If you're going to have the American president in town and there are protests...
It is. I just hope that it comes from a general contingency fund as opposed to coming from individual forces, because I know that my force, London Borough of Sutton, are under huge pressure, and if officers are going to be abstracted from there, perhaps doing overtime, for instance, we want to make sure that doesn't come from the funding that goes towards policing Sutton.
I don't know if you heard Donald Trump this morning at NATO, where he described himself as a stable genius and also claimed that he's managed to persuade NATO to come up with billions of pounds more money to match the American contribution. Do you think that he does pose some sort of threat to the post-war world order?
Well, it's a sort of very odd mixture, because there are some things he does which are clearly very disruptive, and sort of questioning the NATO alliance is definitely one of those. Although, he's then saying can NATO countries meet their 2% obligation, which would strengthen it. So there's a sort of odd contradiction. In other areas, actually, I think he's had a positive influence. So in Syria, for example, when Assad, under Russian sponsorship, used chemical weapons against civilians, Trump, together with the UK, did take action, whereas Obama said he had those famous red lines in August 2013 and then chickened out. And as a result, hundreds more civilians got killed. So it's a very mixed thing. He's very sort of unpredictable, very volatile. Sometimes, like the border example that Rupa mentioned, it was truly terrible. Other examples, like the Syrian chemical weapons, actually it's led to a more positive outcome. So it's an extraordinary mix, which leaves people rather uncertain.
It's a whole list of institutions, though, isn't it? It's NATO, the UN, the EU, the Paris Climate Change Accords. I mean, he doesn't want to play by the rules. And it's one of those things that when he was trying to be elected, it was maybe quite endearing that he was very straight-talking. But I think once you are elected, you have to be deliberative and cautious. And he just shoots his mouth
and
off.
I do wonder why he chooses as his friends people like Putin and Kim Jong-un, and why he...
I'm not sure he's saying that Kim Jong-un is a friend.
Well, he's certainly abandoned the Rocket Man description of Kim Jong-un, but I do wonder why he adopts this approach of trying to get close to people who, frankly, like Putin, I think are unfortunately an enemy of the United Kingdom, and at the same time he threatens the people who have been his long-standing allies. I'm not quite sure why he adopts that approach and what he thinks he's going to extract from adopting that approach.
Well, he presumably would say, not that I'm trying to sort of get into his mind, but I imagine he'd say
that would be difficult.
In relation to NATO members, he's trying to get them to meet their defence commitment. Only 4 out of 29 countries are spending 2%. And on Kim Jong-un, he'd probably say, we failed for like 10 or 20 years to get him to surrender nuclear weapons, and he's trying to do that by meeting them. Now, whether that's successful, we'll see.
I'm not sure that the best way, for instance, to get Germany to make that contribution is to suggest that Germany is in the pocket of Russia. I'm not sure that tactically that is the best way of getting the Germans to do that.
You're right, that's not traditional diplomacy, that is for sure.
He's been insulting us somewhat in turmoil, and all this stuff about my buttons.
Can you read him? I mean, is he a friend of the UK's?
I think he's a friend only of himself. He's self-obsessed.
I think the silence suggests that we probably feel that he isn't a friend, but I think the risk is that we focus too much on him and forget that, of course, we do have a very positive relationship with the US more generally, with the US historically, and that hopefully President Trump is just a temporary feature, and that we will return to perhaps a more stable relationship between these two countries that have a long-standing commitment to each other.
Now, all three of you were in the Commons today with those chaotic scenes over the white paper, the Brexit white paper. Just how much of a shambles was it in there?
Well, I've spoken to both the department responsible, and apparently there was the intention was to release it at 11 o'clock, so that would be about a couple of hours in advance of the debate starting. But there was what amounted to an administrative cock-up, which meant that the message authorising release didn't reach the vote office.
I'm afraid.
So it was not I think it was a mistake. Hang on, let me finish. I think it was a mistake rather than intentional.
Well, I mean, whatever it was, I think unfortunately what it does is just reinforce the point that Brexit and the way it is being handled by the government is a shambles.
How unseemly were the scenes in there?
Yeah, no, totally. Ben Bradshaw was chucking out copies at backbenchers.
They were unseemly, but unfortunately I think what they did was they distracted attention from the content of the document. So I had thought that what would be in the white paper is something that set out very clearly, for instance, what was going to happen in terms of pharmaceuticals, aviation, transport. If you go and look, there's 1 or 2 paragraphs of platitudes about what the UK is seeking to achieve in those areas. So frankly, if that is supposed to be a detailed document, it isn't that.
There's a lot of it to read. We're going to have plenty of time to digest it over the coming weeks. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more time to talk about it, but for the moment, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all my guests tonight, to Dominic, Rupert, Chris and Tom. Like Parliament, we're now taking a summer break, but I'll be back in September. Until then, good night and thank you for watching.